Detective Lauren Hayes stood in the cold hallway of the county courthouse, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She clutched a thick manila folder against her chest, the weight of 18 months of investigation contained within those pages. Today was supposed to be the day everything came together. Today, the woman who had stolen millions from innocent people would finally face justice. The case had consumed Lauren's life for the better part of 2 years. Rebecca Torres, a 42-year-old accountant, stood accused of embezzling $2.3 million from Hope Foundation, a nonprofit that helped struggling families pay their medical bills. The evidence seemed crystal clear. Falsified documents, fake invoices, money moving through shell companies like water through a sieve, and at the end of that money trail sat Rebecca Torres. Lauren had personally arrested Rebecca 3 weeks ago. She remembered that morning vividly. Rebecca lived in a small apartment on the east side of town, the kind of place where the elevator smelled like old carpet and the hallways echoed with every footstep. When Lauren knocked on the door with 2 uniformed officers behind her, Rebecca had answered in pajamas, looking tired and somehow unsurprised. "Rebecca Torres?" Lauren had asked, though she already knew the answer. "Yes," Rebecca had replied simply, her voice steady. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of embezzlement and fraud." Lauren had expected tears, denials, maybe even an attempt to run. Instead, Rebecca had just nodded slowly and asked if she could change clothes first. Now standing in the courthouse, Lauren replayed that moment in her mind. Something about Rebecca's reaction had bothered her, though she couldn't put her finger on why. Most criminals either panicked or performed elaborate shows of innocence. Rebecca had done neither. She had simply accepted the handcuffs with an expression that almost looked like relief. The bailiff's voice echoed down the hallway. "Case number 4729, the state versus Rebecca Torres." Lauren straightened her shoulders and walked into the courtroom. The space was nearly empty, just a handful of people scattered across the wooden benches. A young reporter from the local newspaper sat in the back row, her phone ready to take notes. The court stenographer was setting up her machine. Everything felt routine, ordinary, like any other white-collar crime case that would be forgotten by next week. Rebecca sat at the defense table wearing a suit that clearly didn't belong to her. The sleeves were too long and the shoulders didn't quite fit right. Her court-appointed lawyer, a man named David Chen, who looked fresh out of law school, shuffled through papers with the nervous energy of someone who knew he was outmatched. Judge William Brennan presided over the courtroom from his elevated bench. He was in his mid-60s with silver hair and a reputation for being tough on financial crimes. Lauren had testified in his courtroom before. He ran things by the book, no nonsense, no delays. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Brennan said, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. Rebecca stood. Her lawyer stood beside her, still fumbling with his papers. Lauren watched from her seat behind the prosecutor's table, confident that this case was as solid as they came. The prosecutor, James Mitchell, was a veteran of the district attorney's office. He had tried hundreds of cases and rarely lost. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and began laying out the charges. His voice was clear and practiced as he described how Rebecca had systematically stolen from Hope Foundation over a period of 3 years. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that the defendant created false vendor accounts, submitted fraudulent invoices, and transferred funds to offshore banking accounts under her control. We have bank statements, we have email records, and we have testimony from Foundation board members who trusted her completely." Lauren nodded slightly as James spoke. She had been the one to gather most of that evidence. Hundreds of hours poring over financial records, interviewing witnesses, following digital breadcrumbs across multiple states and countries. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion: Rebecca Torres was guilty. But as the prosecutor continued his opening statement, something unexpected happened. Rebecca leaned over to her lawyer and whispered something in his ear. David's eyes went wide. He looked down at something Rebecca was showing him, then back up at her face, then down again at whatever was in her hands. David raised his hand awkwardly, interrupting the prosecutor mid-sentence. "Your Honor, I apologize, but I need to request an immediate sidebar." Judge Brennan looked annoyed. His thick eyebrows drew together in a frown. "Counselor, we've just begun. What could possibly require a sidebar at this moment?" "Your Honor, my client has just shown me evidence that I believe the court needs to see immediately." It's extremely urgent." The judge sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that said he'd been dealing with young lawyers and their dramatic tactics for far too long. "Very well." Both counsel approach. Lauren watched as David and James walked up to the judge's bench. Rebecca had been holding a manila folder, similar to the one Lauren had been carrying. She had been clutching it since she walked into the courtroom. Now that folder was open on the defense table, and even from her seat, Lauren could see it was filled with documents. At the bench, David handed something to Judge Brennan. Lauren watched the judge's face carefully. She had learned over the years that judges were usually good at hiding their reactions, at maintaining that neutral expression that gave nothing away. But as Judge Brennan looked at whatever David had given him, his face changed. First confusion crossed his features, then something that looked almost like fear. The judge's hands, which had been steady and sure, began to tremble slightly. He looked up at David, then at the prosecutor, then back down at the papers. His face had gone pale, the confident authority draining away like water from a broken dam. "We need a recess," Judge Brennan said, his voice suddenly shaky. 30 minutes. Everyone out except counsel. The bailiff looked surprised but followed orders. "All rise," he called out. Lauren stood with everyone else, her detective instincts screaming that something was very wrong. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. This was supposed to be simple. Open and shut. Rebecca Torres had stolen money, and now she would pay for it. As people filed out of the courtroom, Lauren caught Rebecca's eye for just a moment. The woman who should have looked scared, who should have been sweating through her borrowed suit, looked completely calm. More than calm. She looked like someone who had just played the opening move in a chess game she'd been planning for a very long time. Lauren walked back out into the hallway, her mind racing. James, the prosecutor, came out a moment later looking confused and frustrated. She approached him quickly. "What happened in there?" she asked. "I have no idea," James said, loosening his tie. The judge looked at whatever the defense showed him and went white as a sheet. "I couldn't see what it was, but Brennan's acting like he just saw a ghost." Lauren looked back at the closed courtroom doors. Behind those doors, Judge Brennan was in his chambers with both lawyers, looking at evidence that had somehow changed everything in a matter of seconds. The case she had spent 18 months building, the case that seemed so airtight, was suddenly feeling very different. She thought back to Rebecca's face during the arrest. That strange calm, that look of relief. Had Rebecca been waiting for this moment? Had she wanted to be arrested? The 30-minute recess felt like hours. Lauren paced the hallway, unable to shake the feeling that everything she thought she knew about this case was about to be turned upside down. The courthouse hallway had never felt so long. Lauren paced back and forth, her shoes clicking against the polished floor with each step. Other people waiting for their cases whispered to each other, wondering what was taking so long. The young reporter kept checking her phone, probably worried she'd miss her deadline. But all Lauren could think about was what was happening behind those closed doors. 20 minutes into the recess, James Mitchell came out of the courtroom. His tie was loosened, and his usually perfect hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it. The confident prosecutor who had walked into court that morning now looked like a man who'd just had his entire world questioned. "Still nothing?" Lauren asked, moving quickly to his side. James shook his head. "The judge ordered me out. He's still in there with David and the defendant. Lauren, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Brennan looked at those papers like they were a death sentence. "What did you see? Even a glimpse?" "Bank statements. Account numbers. That's all I caught before he closed the folder." James leaned against the wall, looking exhausted. "But here's what's eating at me. Those account numbers looked familiar. Really familiar." Lauren's stomach tightened. "Familiar how?" "Like I'd seen them before. In our evidence files." James met her eyes. "The same account numbers we're using to prosecute Rebecca Torres." Before Lauren could respond, the courtroom doors opened. The bailiff stepped out and called everyone back inside. His face was unreadable, but Lauren had worked with enough court officials to know when something serious was happening. The man's jaw was clenched tight, and he wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. The courtroom felt different when they walked back in. The air seemed heavy, or charged with tension. Judge Brennan sat at his bench, but he looked like a completely different person than the confident man who'd started the proceedings. His face was still pale, and his hands gripped the edge of the bench like he needed something solid to hold on to. Rebecca sat at the defense table, that same calm expression on her face. Her lawyer, David, looked nervous but also strangely excited, like a student who just discovered something important in a textbook everyone else had overlooked. "This court will come to order," Judge Brennan said, his voice lacking its usual authority. He cleared his throat twice before continuing. "We need to address a matter that has come to light. Detective Hayes, please approach the bench." Lauren felt every eye in the courtroom turn toward her. She walked forward, her heart pounding. What could the judge possibly need from her? "Detective, you were the lead investigator on this case, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you personally verified all the evidence, including the bank account information that forms the basis of the charges against Ms. Torres?" "I did, Your Honor. Every piece of evidence was thoroughly checked and verified." Judge Brennan nodded slowly. He picked up a piece of paper from his desk. "Can you verify these account numbers? Are these the accounts you traced the stolen funds to?" Lauren took the paper and studied it carefully. The numbers matched exactly. "Yes, Your Honor. These are the accounts where the money from Hope Foundation ended up. These accounts were opened in Rebecca Torres's name." "Are you certain?" "Absolutely certain. I spent months tracing this money trail." The judge took the paper back. Then he picked up another document from Rebecca's folder. "And what about these account numbers, Detective?" Lauren looked at the second paper. Her breath caught in her throat. The account numbers were the same. Exactly the same. But the names on the accounts were different. Instead of Rebecca Torres, she saw other names. Names she recognized. City Council member Richard Palmer. Deputy Mayor Christine Valdez. And at the bottom of the list, one name that made her blood run cold. William Brennan, Personal Holdings. "Your Honor, Lauren's voice trailed off. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "These are the same account numbers, aren't they, Detective?" Judge Brennan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, but I don't understand. These accounts were registered to Rebecca Torres. I saw the documentation myself." Rebecca stood up then. Her lawyer tried to gently pull her back down, but she shook her head. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. Nothing like the quiet woman Lauren had arrested 3 weeks ago. "Your Honor, I think it's time for the truth. Detective Hayes isn't wrong. She followed the evidence exactly as it was presented to her. The problem is that evidence was planted. Those accounts were created to frame me." The courtroom erupted. The reporter in the back started typing furiously on her phone. The bailiff stepped forward, looking uncertain about what he should do. James Mitchell jumped to his feet, objecting loudly. Judge Brennan banged his gavel, but his hand was shaking so badly the sound came out weak. "Order. Order in this court." Lauren stood frozen at the bench, trying to process what Rebecca had just said. Planted evidence? That was impossible. She had been so careful, so thorough. Every document had been verified, every transaction traced back through legitimate banking channels. "Ms. Torres," Judge Brennan said slowly, "these are serious accusations. Do you have proof?" "I do, Your Honor. That's why I'm here. That's why I let myself be arrested." Rebecca pulled out more papers from her folder. "My name is Rebecca Torres, and yes, I worked for Hope Foundation. But I wasn't their director. I was hired as a forensic accountant to investigate missing funds. The foundation's board noticed discrepancies in their accounts 18 months ago. They brought me in quietly to figure out where the money was going." Lauren felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. "That's not possible. All the records show you were the director." "The records were altered," Rebecca said, turning to face Lauren directly. "I'm sorry, Detective. You were used. We both were. When I started digging into Hope Foundation's finances, I found something much bigger than simple embezzlement. I found a network, a system that had been stealing from nonprofits across the entire city for years. And you're claiming I'm part of this network?" Judge Brennan's voice had an edge to it now, defensive. "I'm not claiming anything, Your Honor. I'm presenting evidence. Bank statements showing that the same accounts used to steal from Hope Foundation were also used to steal from 4 other charitable organizations. Accounts that ultimately trace back to a small group of city officials who had oversight of these nonprofits." David, Rebecca's lawyer, stood up and handed more documents to the bailiff, who brought them to the judge. Your Honor, these documents show that the accounts registered in Ms. Torres's name were created using falsified identification. The real accounts, the ones where the money actually ended up, belong to the individuals listed on the papers Detective Hayes just examined. Lauren's mind flashed back through her entire investigation. The anonymous tip that had started everything, the way the evidence had seemed almost too perfect, too easy to follow. She had thought she was a good detective following a clear trail. Now she realized she'd been a puppet, dancing on strings pulled by people who knew exactly how to manipulate an investigation. Your Honor, Rebecca continued, I knew I couldn't trust the normal channels. When I discovered how deep this went, I realized that if I reported it through official means, it would be buried. So I made a choice. I allowed myself to be arrested. I let Detective Hayes build her case, because I knew that eventually we'd end up here, in a courtroom, where everything would have to be presented publicly. You're saying you sacrificed yourself? Lauren asked, her voice barely working. Rebecca looked at her with tired eyes. I'm saying I trusted that eventually the truth would matter more than the lies. I knew you were a good detective, Lauren. I knew that if I could just get to this moment, in front of a judge with all the evidence laid out, someone would have to listen. Judge Brennan sat very still. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for his response. Outside the tall windows, clouds moved across the sun, casting shadows that seemed to match the darkness settling over the proceedings. Finally, the judge spoke. This court is going to take a short recess while I review all of this evidence. Detective Hayes, I need you to contact your captain immediately. We may need additional officers present. As Judge Brennan stood to leave, Lauren saw something in his movements. A hesitation, a fear, and she realized with absolute certainty that Rebecca was telling the truth. The man in the black robe wasn't just a judge reviewing evidence. He was a guilty man watching his world begin to crumble. Lauren's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone in the courthouse hallway. The number for Captain Rodriguez was on speed dial. She'd called him hundreds of times over the years, usually with good news about closed cases and arrests. This call would be different. Rodriguez, his gruff voice answered on the second ring. Captain, it's Hayes. I'm at the courthouse for the Torres case and we have a situation. Lauren took a deep breath. A serious situation. I need backup at the courthouse immediately. And sir, you need to hear this yourself. What kind of situation are we talking about? The kind where a sitting judge might be involved in a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme, and I might have arrested the wrong person. There was silence on the other end. Then, I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't let anyone leave that building. Lauren hung up and turned around to find Rebecca standing a few feet away. Her lawyer, David, stood beside her, looking protective. Up close, Lauren could see the dark circles under Rebecca's eyes, the weight she'd probably lost during her weeks in jail. This woman had suffered, and if her story was true, she'd suffered because she was trying to do the right thing. Why didn't you just tell me? Lauren asked, her voice rough with emotion. When I arrested you, why didn't you explain what you were really doing? Rebecca gave her a sad smile. Would you have believed me? A woman claiming she's innocent saying a judge and city officials framed her? It would have sounded like a desperate lie. Besides, Detective, who would you have reported it to? Your captain? The district attorney? How would you know who was safe to trust? The words hit Lauren hard, because Rebecca was right. If someone had come to her with this story, she would have thought they were paranoid or delusional. The system was supposed to work. Judges were supposed to be honest. But standing here now with all the evidence laid out, Lauren realized how naive she'd been. Those weeks in jail, Lauren said quietly. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry yet, Rebecca replied. We're not finished. Judge Brennan is in his chambers right now, probably trying to figure out how to make this all disappear. That's why I needed you here. Why I needed this to be public. He can't make it go away if there are witnesses. Before Lauren could respond, she saw movement through the courtroom windows. Judge Brennan was standing up, gathering papers from his desk, but he wasn't moving toward the courtroom door. He was heading toward his private chambers, toward the back exit that judges use to avoid crowds. "He's running," Lauren said, already moving. Her instincts kicked in. The same instincts that had made her a good detective even when she was following the wrong trail. "Stay here," she told Rebecca and David. Lauren pushed through the courtroom doors. "Bailiff, stop him!" The bailiff, a man named Tom who'd worked courthouse security for 20 years, looked torn. He glanced between Lauren and the judge's retreating figure. "Detective, I can't just—" "Tom, if you let him leave, you're helping a criminal escape. I know this is hard, but you need to trust me right now." Something in Lauren's voice must have convinced him. Tom moved quickly, positioning himself in front of the chamber door just as Judge Brennan reached for the handle. "Your Honor, I'm going to need you to return to the courtroom." Judge Brennan's face flushed red. "Step aside, Tom. I'm ordering you to move." "I can't do that, sir." The judge's hands were shaking and sweat beaded on his forehead. For 18 years he'd worn that black robe, commanded respect, held people's fates in his hands. Now he looked like what he really was, a scared man who knew he'd been caught. Lauren stepped forward, her badge visible on her belt, her hand resting near her handcuffs. "Judge Brennan, I need you to come with me back into the courtroom. We need to sort this out properly." "You don't understand what you're doing," Brennan said, his voice desperate. "This is bigger than you know. You can't just what? Can't arrest someone who's been stealing from charities? Can't hold powerful people accountable?" Lauren felt anger rising in her chest. "Those nonprofits you stole from, they helped people who couldn't afford medical care. They fed families who were struggling. And you took that money for what? A bigger house? A boat?" The courtroom doors opened again and Captain Rodriguez walked in with 2 uniformed officers. He was a stocky man in his 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He took in the scene immediately, the judge trying to flee, the bailiff blocking his way, Lauren standing ready to make an arrest. "Someone want to tell me what's happening?" Rodriguez asked, his voice calm but commanding. Lauren quickly explained everything. Rebecca's real job as a forensic accountant, the planted evidence, the network of corrupt officials, the bank accounts that matched but had different names. As she spoke, she watched her captain's expression grow darker. When she finished, Rodriguez turned to Judge Brennan. "Your Honor, I think you need to sit down. We're going to need to ask you some questions." "I want my lawyer," Brennan said immediately. "That's your right," Rodriguez agreed. "But you're not leaving this courthouse until we get to the bottom of this." By now, more people had gathered. James Mitchell, the prosecutor, stood in the doorway looking like someone had knocked the wind out of him. Court staff whispered to each other. The reporter was filming everything on her phone until Tom gently asked her to put it away. Rebecca entered the courtroom with David close behind. She carried her folder of evidence like it was the most precious thing in the world, and in a way it was. That folder represented 18 months of careful work, of gathering proof while pretending to be a criminal, of risking everything for the truth. "Captain Rodriguez," Rebecca said, approaching the senior officer. "My name is Rebecca Torres. I'm the forensic accountant who uncovered this fraud. I have documentation of everything. Bank statements, forged documents, email trails, recordings of conversations. It's all here." Rodriguez took the folder carefully, handling it like the evidence it was. "Miss Torres, why don't you start from the beginning?" And she did. Right there in the courtroom, with Judge Brennan sitting at the defense table for a change, Rebecca told her story. She explained how Hope Foundation's board had noticed money going missing about 2 years ago. Small amounts at first, easy to miss, but it had added up over time. "They hired me quietly," Rebecca said. "No announcement, no official records, just a private contract to investigate. What I found was horrifying. It wasn't just Hope Foundation. The same pattern appeared in 4 other nonprofits across the city. Money would disappear through fake vendor payments, fraudulent invoices, shell companies. And the trail led to Judge Brennan?" Rodriguez asked, "to him and others. But here's the thing that made it so hard to prove. They were smart about it. The money would move through so many accounts, get split up and moved around, that by the time it reached them, it looked clean. Just regular investment accounts, business holdings, real estate purchases." Lauren listened, piecing together how she'd been used. "The anonymous tip that started my investigation. That was them, wasn't it? They found out you were getting close, so they decided to frame you." Rebecca nodded. "They created accounts in my name using stolen identity documents. Then they moved some of the money through those accounts, just enough to create a trail. After that, all they had to do was point the police in my direction. You did exactly what a good detective should do. You followed the evidence. You just didn't know the evidence had been manufactured. But you let yourself be arrested, Rodriguez said, trying to understand. You could have run. Why stay? Because running would have made me look guilty. And because I knew that if I could just get to court, if I could present my evidence in a public setting, it would be harder for them to cover it up. Once we're standing in a courtroom with witnesses and court reporters and official records, the truth has protection. They couldn't just make me disappear. Judge Brennan finally spoke, his voice bitter. You have no idea what you've done. The people involved in this, they're not going to just let this go. You've made yourself a target. Maybe, Rebecca said calmly, but at least I can sleep at night. Captain Rodriguez closed the folder and looked at Judge Brennan. Your Honor, I'm going to need you to come down to the station with us. We have a lot of questions, and I think you know you have a lot of answers to provide. Lauren watched as her captain nodded to the uniformed officers. This was the moment. The moment when everything changed. She reached for the handcuffs on her belt, the same handcuffs she'd used to arrest Rebecca 3 weeks ago. Judge William Brennan, Lauren said, her voice steady despite the surreal nature of what she was doing. I'm placing you under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As she secured the handcuffs around the judge's wrists, Lauren felt the weight of the moment. A man who had sentenced countless others was now being led away in chains himself. The black robe that had given him authority couldn't protect him anymore. Rebecca stood watching, tears finally streaming down her face. Not tears of victory, but tears of relief. The nightmare was ending. The truth was finally coming out into the light. The police station felt different to Lauren that afternoon. She'd walked these halls thousands of times, but now everything looked strange, like she was seeing it all for the first time. In interview room 3, former Judge William Brennan sat across from her and Captain Rodriguez, his expensive suit wrinkled, his hands folded on the metal table. The handcuffs were off now, but a uniformed officer stood by the door. I want to make a deal, Brennan said. His voice had lost all its courtroom authority. Now he just sounded tired and old. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. You're not in a position to make deals yet. First, we need to know everything. How long has this been going on? Who else is involved? Brennan looked down at his hands. 8 years. It started small. Deputy Mayor Christine Valdez approached me at a fundraiser. She said she'd found a way to redirect funds from nonprofits that were poorly managed. Said we'd be doing good putting the money to better use. Better use meaning your pockets? Lauren couldn't keep the disgust out of her voice. At first, it really did seem harmless. These organizations had so much waste, so much bureaucracy. We took small amounts we thought wouldn't be missed. Brennan shook his head. But it grew. Once you see how easy it is, you can't stop. Christine brought in Richard Palmer from the city council. He brought in others. Before I knew it, we had a whole network. How many people? Rodriguez asked, taking notes. 7 in total. All people with oversight of charitable organizations in the city. We had access to their accounts, their boards, their audits. It was perfect. Until Rebecca Torres. Lauren thought about Rebecca, who was probably at home right now, finally able to sleep in her own bed without fear. When did you find out about her investigation? About 6 months ago. Palmer sits on Hope Foundation's board. He noticed Rebecca asking too many questions, requesting records that didn't fit with her supposed role. He had her checked out and discovered she was actually a forensic accountant, not their director. That's when we knew we had to act fast. So you framed her, Lauren said flatly. Brennan nodded slowly. Valdez had connections with someone who could create false identity documents. We opened accounts in Rebecca's name, moved enough money through them to create a trail. Then we arranged for an anonymous tip to reach the police department. We knew you'd investigate, Detective Hayes. You have a reputation for being thorough. The word stung. Lauren had been so proud of her work on this case, so certain she was putting away a criminal. Instead, she'd been a tool used by the real criminals to attack an innocent woman. What about the other nonprofits? Rodriguez asked. Rebecca mentioned 4 others. 5 total, including Hope Foundation. All of them served low-income families. Medical assistance, food banks, housing support, after-school programs. Brennan's voice was barely a whisper now. We stole from people who had nothing. I know how that sounds. I know what I've done. Over the next 2 hours, Brennan gave them everything. Names, dates, account numbers, meeting locations. He explained how they'd launder the money through shell companies and real estate investments, how they'd cover their tracks by creating fake audits and destroying original documents, how they'd use their positions of power to intimidate anyone who asked too many questions. When the interview finally ended, Lauren stepped out into the hallway and leaned against the wall. Her head was pounding. Her entire understanding of the system she'd devoted her career to had been shaken. Captain Rodriguez joined her, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her. "You did good work in there." "I arrested an innocent woman, Captain." "I nearly destroyed her life. You followed the evidence you had." "That's what detectives do. The fact that the evidence was planted isn't your fault." Rodriguez took a sip of his coffee. "What matters is what you do now. We have a lot of work ahead. Brennan gave us names, but we need to build cases against all of them, and we need to do it right this time." Lauren nodded. "I want to be part of it. All of it. I was counting on that. But first I need you to do something else." Rodriguez pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "This is Rebecca Torres's address. I think you owe her a visit." An hour later, Lauren stood outside Rebecca's apartment building, the same building where she'd made the arrest 3 weeks ago. The elevator still smelled like old carpet. The hallways still echoed with every step. But this time, Lauren wasn't here as an arresting officer. She wasn't sure what she was. Rebecca answered the door in jeans and a sweater, looking more relaxed than Lauren had ever seen her. "Detective Hayes, I wondered if you'd come. Can we talk?" Rebecca stepped aside to let her in. The apartment was small but comfortable, filled with books and papers. A laptop sat open on the kitchen table, spreadsheets visible on the screen. Even after everything, Rebecca was still working. "I need to apologize," Lauren started, but Rebecca held up a hand. "You don't. You were doing your job. I knew the risks when I let myself be arrested. I knew there was a chance my plan wouldn't work, that I'd end up in prison for crimes I didn't commit. But it was worth the risk. Worth spending weeks in jail? Worth facing decades in prison?" Rebecca sat down at the kitchen table and gestured for Lauren to join her. "Do you know why I became a forensic accountant, Detective? I grew up poor. Really poor. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. When I was 12, she got sick. Cancer. We had no insurance, no savings. Hope Foundation paid for her treatment. They saved her life." Lauren felt something tighten in her chest. That's why when I discovered someone was stealing from them, from all these organizations that help people like my family I couldn't just walk away. I couldn't let them get away with it. Even if it meant sacrificing everything, it was worth it to stop them. "Brennan's talking," Lauren said. "He gave us everything. All the names, all the details. We're building cases against all of them right now." "How many?" 7 total. Deputy Mayor Christine Valdez, City Council Member Richard Palmer, and 4 others. All people in positions of trust who were supposed to be protecting these charities, not robbing them. Rebecca closed her eyes, and Lauren saw tears slip down her cheeks. 7 people whose greed hurt thousands of families who needed help. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Lauren asked the question that had been bothering her since the courtroom. "How did you stay so calm? During the arrest, during the jail time, even in court today, you never panicked, never broke down." "I did break down," Rebecca said with a sad smile, "just not where anyone could see. At night in my cell, I'd lie awake terrified that my plan wouldn't work, terrified that the evidence I'd gathered wouldn't be enough. But I had to stay strong during the day because if I showed fear, if I acted like a typical innocent person proclaiming their innocence, they'd just dismiss me as desperate. You took an incredible risk. The alternative was worse. If I'd tried to report this through normal channels, it would have been buried. Who would believe a forensic accountant over a judge and a deputy mayor? They would have discredited me, probably destroyed the evidence, maybe even come after me more directly. At least this way, with the arrest, with the public court hearing, there was a chance for the truth to come out." Lauren thought about that, about the courage it took to trust a broken system enough to believe it could still work, if pushed in the right direction. "What happens now for you?" "I don't know. My reputation's been damaged. Even though charges were dropped, people will always remember that I was arrested for embezzlement. Finding work will be hard." Rebecca looked at her laptop. "But I've already had a call from the State Attorney General's office. They want to talk to me about a position investigating public corruption. You'd stay in this line of work? After everything? What else would I do? This is what I'm good at. Following money trails, finding patterns, exposing fraud. And there's so much more work to be done. If there's a network like this in our city, there are probably others elsewhere. Lauren stood up to leave, but paused at the door. Rebecca, I know you said I don't need to apologize, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry. I should have questioned the evidence more, should have dug deeper. You're questioning it now. You're digging deeper now. That's what matters. Rebecca walked her to the door. Besides, Detective, we make a pretty good team when we're working together instead of against each other. As Lauren walked back down the echoing hallway, she thought about those words. A pretty good team. Over the next few weeks, they would need to be 7 arrests to make, 7 cases to build, and beyond that, the work of fixing the system that had allowed this corruption to flourish. But for the first time since the courtroom revelations, Lauren felt something like hope. The system had been broken and abused, but it had also worked in the end. It had worked because people like Rebecca refused to give up on it, and because people like Lauren were willing to admit when they were wrong and fight to make things right. Her phone buzzed with a text from Captain Rodriguez. Team meeting tomorrow morning. We're forming a task force. You're leading it. Lauren smiled. She typed back a simple response. I'll be there. The real work was just beginning. 3 months had passed since that day in the courtroom when everything changed. Lauren stood outside the same courthouse again, but this time the circumstances were completely different. Media vans lined the street. Reporters jostled for position on the steps. News helicopters circled overhead. This wasn't just another case anymore. This was the trial that had captured national attention. The case against former Judge William Brennan and his co-conspirators had become one of the biggest corruption scandals in the state's history. Every day brought new revelations about how deep the fraud had gone, how many people had been hurt, how much money had been stolen from those who needed it most. Lauren adjusted her jacket and headed up the courthouse steps. People shouted questions at her, but she'd learned to tune them out. She had a job to do today. She was testifying. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every seat filled, people standing in the back, security guards positioned at every door. This wasn't the quiet, nearly empty room where Rebecca's case had started. This was justice on display, and everyone wanted to watch. Judge Patricia Okoye presided over the trial. She was a serious woman in her 50s, known for her fairness and her refusal to be intimidated by powerful people. When the corruption scandal broke, she'd been brought in from another district specifically because she had no connections to anyone involved. Rebecca sat at the prosecution table, not as a defendant this time, but as a special consultant. She'd been working closely with the district attorney's office, helping them understand the complex financial schemes that Brennan and his network had used. Her expertise had been invaluable. Without her guidance, prosecutors admitted they might never have been able to untangle the web of fake companies and hidden accounts. Lauren took her seat in the witness area and waited. The prosecution attorney, a woman named Jennifer Liu who specialized in white-collar crime, stood up to call her to the stand. The state calls Detective Lauren Hayes. Lauren walked to the witness stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Looking out at the courtroom, she saw all of them. William Brennan sat at the defense table, looking smaller somehow without his judge's robes. Next to him sat Deputy Mayor Christine Valdez, City Council member Richard Palmer, and the 4 other officials who'd been part of the conspiracy. 7 people who'd betrayed the public trust in the worst possible way. Jennifer Liu approached the stand with a warm but professional smile. Detective Hayes, can you tell us about your initial investigation into Rebecca Torres? Lauren took a breath and began. She explained how she'd received an anonymous tip about embezzlement at Hope Foundation, how she'd spent months following what she thought was a clear trail of evidence, how thorough she'd been, how careful, how certain she was that she had the right person. And when did you realize you'd been deceived? Jennifer asked. In the courtroom 3 months ago, when Rebecca presented evidence showing that the accounts I'd traced to her name actually belonged to the defendants. That's when I understood I'd been used as a tool to frame an innocent person. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting she'd been incompetent or lazy in her investigation. But Lauren stood firm. She admitted her mistakes openly, explained exactly how the planted evidence had fooled her, and made it clear that the deception had been sophisticated and deliberate. When she finished testifying, Lauren stepped down and took a seat in the gallery. Rebecca caught her eye and gave her a small nod of encouragement. Over the past 3 months, they'd worked together almost daily. What had started as a detective investigating a suspect had evolved into something like friendship, built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to seeing justice done. The trial continued for 2 more weeks. Expert witnesses explained the financial fraud in detail. Accountants showed how $8.3 million had been stolen across 5 charitable organizations over 8 years. Board members from the affected charities testified about how the theft had forced them to cut programs, turn away families in need, and struggle to keep their doors open. One testimony hit particularly hard. A woman named Patricia Kim took the stand, her voice shaking but determined. She explained how her family had been helped by the Children's Health Fund, one of the targeted charities, when her son was diagnosed with leukemia. The fund had paid for treatments her insurance wouldn't cover. "Because of their help, my son is alive today," Patricia said, tears streaming down her face. "But I found out last month that the fund had to close its emergency assistance program. They said they didn't have enough money anymore. How many other families didn't get help because these people stole what was meant for sick children?" The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even the defense attorneys looked uncomfortable. There was no way to make stealing from sick children look anything but monstrous. Rebecca testified last. She walked to the stand wearing a simple blue suit, her hair pulled back, looking every bit the professional accountant she was. For over 3 hours, she explained her investigation in meticulous detail. She had documents, recordings, emails, everything carefully organized and labeled. "Ms. Torres," Jennifer Liu asked, "you chose to allow yourself to be arrested rather than report this through normal channels. Can you explain that decision?" Rebecca looked directly at the jury. "When I discovered that a sitting judge was involved in the fraud, I realized I couldn't trust the system to investigate itself. If I'd gone to the police or the district attorney with my suspicions, the evidence might have disappeared. People in power might have protected each other. But in a public courtroom, with witnesses and reporters and official records, the truth would be harder to bury. That was an enormous risk. You could have gone to prison. Yes, but the alternative was letting them get away with stealing from people who desperately needed help. That wasn't acceptable to me. Some risks are worth taking." When the defense cross-examined Rebecca, they tried to paint her as reckless, as someone who'd manipulated the justice system for her own purposes. But she remained calm and clear, answering every question with facts and documentation. She never got angry, never got defensive. She simply told the truth. The closing arguments came next. The defense attorneys argued that their clients had made mistakes but hadn't intended real harm, that the financial complexities made it easy to lose track of where money was going, that they deserved mercy. But Jennifer Liu's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity. "The defendants want you to believe this was complicated, that it was a mistake, that they deserve understanding. But let me make it simple. They stole money from cancer patients, from homeless families, from children who needed food. They stole it not because they needed it to survive, but because they were greedy. They used their positions of power and trust to take what belonged to the most vulnerable people in our community. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. And choices have consequences." The jury deliberated for 2 days. Lauren spent those days working on her regular cases, trying to distract herself, but her mind kept drifting back to the courthouse. Finally, her phone rang. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was even more packed than before. Lauren managed to find a seat near the front. Rebecca sat at the prosecution table, her hands folded calmly, but Lauren could see the tension in her shoulders. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Okoye asked. The jury foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of embezzlement in the first degree, how do you find the defendant, William Brennan?" "Guilty," the word echoed through the courtroom. One by one, the verdicts came: guilty, guilty, guilty. All 7 defendants guilty on all counts. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, abuse of public trust. The jury had seen through every defense, every excuse, every attempt to minimize what they'd done. Some of the defendants started crying. Christine Valdez sat stone-faced, refusing to show emotion. William Brennan simply stared at the table in front of him, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Judge Okoye scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. When that day came, she showed no mercy. William Brennan received 15 years in federal prison. The others received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years, depending on their level of involvement. Beyond the prison time, they were ordered to pay back every dollar they'd stolen plus damages. After the sentencing, Lauren found Rebecca on the courthouse steps. The media had already swarmed her, asking for comments, but Rebecca had politely declined and moved away from the cameras. "It's over," Rebecca said softly, looking up at the courthouse building. "It's over," Lauren agreed. "You did it. You brought down an entire corruption network. We did it. I couldn't have exposed them without you being willing to admit the truth, to change course when you realized you'd been wrong." "That took courage too," Lauren smiled. "I heard you took the job with the Attorney General's office. I start next month. They want me to help investigate public corruption statewide. Apparently there are several cases that could use someone with my particular experience. And they couldn't find anyone with more experience in taking down corrupt officials," Lauren added. "What about you? I heard Captain Rodriguez put you in charge of a new task force. Public Corruption Unit. We'll be watching for the kind of fraud that almost succeeded here, making sure it doesn't happen again." Lauren paused. "Rebecca, can I ask you something? During those weeks in jail, when you were sitting in that cell not knowing if your plan would work, were you scared?" Rebecca looked at her for a long moment. "Terrified. Every single day. But fear isn't a good enough reason not to do what's right. My mother taught me that. She was scared every day of her cancer treatment, but she kept fighting because she had something worth fighting for. I had something worth fighting for too." They stood together on the courthouse steps as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the building where justice had finally been served. Not perfectly, not without cost, but served nonetheless. "You know what the best part is?" Rebecca said. "Hope Foundation reopened their emergency assistance program last week. The money we recovered is going back to the charities. Families are getting help again." That, Lauren thought, was what made all of it worthwhile. Not the headlines or the guilty verdicts or the prison sentences, though those mattered. What mattered most was that people who needed help would get it again. Children with cancer would receive treatment. Homeless families would find shelter. Hungry people would be fed. One woman's courage to risk everything for the truth had made that possible. And Lauren knew that she'd carry that lesson with her for the rest of her career. Justice wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about protecting the innocent, helping the vulnerable, and being willing to admit when you were wrong so you could make it right. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, Lauren's phone buzzed with a new case file. Rebecca's phone buzzed too, probably with another corruption investigation to review. They both smiled. The work, as always, continued. But now they knew something important. The system could be broken, could be abused, could be corrupted, but it could also be fixed by people who refused to give up on it. And that made all the difference.